Okay, so I'm going to make a start now. So welcome everybody who's joining. Welcome to this afternoon's event where we'll be focusing on the role of livestock in sub-Saharan Africa. I'm Tara Garnett, I'm the director of Table. For those who don't know, Table is a collaboration between 6 universities, the University of Oxford, where I'm based, Wageningen, the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences, the University of the Andes, Mexico, and Cornell, with whom this event's being joint organised. So Table looks at debates in and around the future of food and tries to explore why we disagree and what evidence and values people bring to their discussions, as well as where it might be possible to identify areas of commonality. So that's inevitable that livestock are going to be a major focus of our work because we know that the livestock question is both complex and highly polarised. People come at the issue from very different disciplinary, sectoral, and geographical perspectives. So while there's broad overarching agreement that global trends in livestock production are problematic and unsustainable, at a local level, the issues are much more complex since livestock can be crucial in supporting livelihoods as a source of nutrition, in maintaining certain ecosystem services, and as a climate adaptation strategy. So we have the top down and we have the bottom up, more regionally or locally focused approaches. And that interaction between the top down and the bottom up is what we want to explore this afternoon. So to do that, it gives me enormous pleasure to welcome 4 panellists to the session, all of whom have long-standing experience of working on livestock issues in sub-Saharan Africa and beyond. Mario Herrero from Cornell University, Laura Kramer from the International Livestock Research Institute, ILRI, Guya Roba, also from ILRI, and Anne Nottenbert from CIAT, the International Centre for Tropical Agriculture. I'm not going to spend time introducing them fully because we're just going to post their bios in the chat. So the format for this afternoon is some short introductory remarks from each of the 4 speakers. There won't be any PowerPoints, and that's going to be followed by a panel discussion, and then we'll open up to questions from the audience for the final half hour. When you post your questions, can you do so in the Q&A rather than the chat, although do use the chat if you want to, but just not for questions. So I've asked Mario to open by giving a big picture overview of global trends and impacts within the livestock production and consumption sector. And then I've asked the other 3 speakers to briefly address 4 questions. So first, a very brief overview of what they do, their work. Then the second question is their impression of the livestock debate from where they're sitting in Kenya and perhaps more broadly within sub-Saharan Africa. And importantly, how they also perceive what their impression is of the debate in the global north. That's the first. And then the second are the key issues, trends, and opportunities for livestock in the context of current sub-Saharan African needs and trends. And then finally, what the difficult questions, trade-offs, compromises, conflicts might be that need to be balanced. So that's it from me for now. I just have to say that this event is being recorded and will be available to watch and share in the next week or so on our website and on YouTube. So over to you, Mario.
Thanks a lot, Tara. It's a pleasure to be here in this webinar. Thanks for organizing it. I think it's very pertinent due to the importance of the role of the livestock sector in a sustainable food future. I've been asked to give a global picture, and let me start. Livestock is the largest land use system on Earth. It's enormous. It has an enormous amount of value, both in animals and in production. It's a very diverse sector with a multitude of systems. So it's very, very difficult to generalize impacts, generalize the trade-offs, and so on. The narratives of the OECD countries are very different to those of low and middle income countries. On one hand, you have all heard the debate around overconsumption, mainly in OECD countries, but the reality is that in a lot of places, including sub-Saharan Africa, there is still a significant need for nutrient-dense foods, and the livestock provide a really good, a really good set of these in a way that also helps with increasing incomes of producers, increasing some environmental benefits in places as well. Let's think a little bit of the trends that we are observing. And we know that consumption in general terms, you could say from livestock is increasing, but when you take into account different species, the picture is completely different. So for example, let me tell you about red meat, beef. Beef has stagnated basically everywhere in the world. We even see that in high-income countries, we get decreases in consumption per capita of beef. And we've been experiencing this in the last 20 years or so. While, for example, for poultry and pork, we see significant increases in consumption, especially in low and middle income countries. And for milk, it's roughly the same, but it's more patchy. You know, in some places you see high increases, and in other places less so. In terms of environmental impacts, you know, we've placed a lot of focus on emissions, and well, rightly so. But at the same time, there are other things that are potentially more important. I think that when we talk about the livestock sector, it's always very useful to start with land use. Why land use? Land use simply because, you know, the footprint, the land use footprint of the livestock sector is enormous. And any strategy that we want to improve livestock production requires, you know, to reduce this environmental footprint. So, for example, let's take how we're producing at the moment. At the moment, we have had some really good gains in places and in sectoral growth. Take the case of dairy. In the case of dairy, we've managed to do sustainable intensification. You know, in many places, we see reductions in the numbers of animals and increases in productivity and total production. But, you know, for other species and for other trends, we still see, you know, the increases in animal numbers are still driving the production. And this obviously it creates a problem because it's very difficult to reduce net emissions from the livestock sector, for example, or resource use if animal numbers are increasing. And this just happens because, you know, we have a fixed maintenance cost from each animal that we bring into the world. So I think that a prerequisite for achieving, you know, nutrition, livelihoods, and everything is to reduce the size of the livestock sector in places, but in many cases, not necessarily compromising production. In many cases, we know that we can actually produce at least the same, but at significantly lower footprints. That will actually, you know, in many cases, reduce methane emissions. Obviously, it will reduce land use and as a result, also CO2 emissions. There will be also reductions in nitrous oxide. And in general terms, you know, land could be freed for a range of other things, for example, for producing fruits and vegetables and a range of other things that are required to achieve a healthy diet. Now, this is an absolute global picture. I would say that in many cases, we will need the reductions in consumption simply because these are largely associated with a whole obesity syndrome and with non-communicable diseases. But this is mostly a high-income country problem, I would say. It's very hard. It's really not very easy to get rid of quite ingrained patterns of consumption. The instruments are really poor in terms of trying to promote a reduction in consumption of livestock. They haven't worked very well. But certainly it is an area where we will need probably a new impetus in trying to do that. Then there's other groups, livestock. One of the beauties of it is that it can use land not suitable for other uses. Very little competition with cropland in some places. So, we have still pastoralist groups that, harness a lot of a cultural diversity for the world, harness a series of practices that we obviously don't want to use, and their livestock, when well managed, also contribute to ecosystem services in the form of modest amounts of carbon sequestration, maintenance of biodiversity, and others. So Tara, the picture is very, very complex. You asked me as a final question, how does livestock look in the future? And I would say, probably a little bit of more productive livestock with less animals, with a lower footprint, probably using more also alternative feed sources, circular feed sources, for example, and really with consumption being not something that, as I grew up in Latin America, not the steak a day, but something way more modest consumption, everything in moderation. Let me leave it here to let my other colleagues contribute. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mario. Laura, let me move on to you.
Thank you so much, Tara. And thanks, Mario, for such a good overview. I'm really glad that you brought out the diversity and the complexity of these issues. So as the bio says in the chat, I work at ILRI on science policy interfaces. So a lot of the work that my colleagues here on the call and lots of others at ILRI and in national ag research systems are doing, we try to get that into the hands of policymakers and decision makers, and also climate change negotiators. That's one of the big groups that I work with, is a group called the Africa Group of Negotiators Expert Support. And with them, we've been working on developing a new livestock narrative for Africa, because, Mario did highlight the nuances, the diversity between the different systems around the world. But a lot of time, the livestock debate lumps everything together, and it really has negative effects on how we're able to operate and how the, international climate negotiations are being done. So it's, that lack of nuance when we just say all livestock are bad, eating meat and milk, it all needs to reduce everywhere. That can really harm the efforts of livestock development in the sector in sub-Saharan Africa. And so, we see these views from the debate in the North that are really kind of creeping in and making it difficult to add in that nuance and to really show that it's not just emissions from livestock that we need to pay attention to, but in Africa, they are playing a huge role in people's food security and nutrition. When we look at the differences in consumption levels between the US, where people eat 124 kilos per person per year, versus a place like Kenya, where that's 15.9 kilos, or Ethiopia, where that's 5.4 kilos, it's just worlds of difference. Within the economy, household income from livestock in pastoral areas is 55%, 35% within mixed crop livestock systems. And so, that importance of livestock within the economy is also really something that needs to be considered. And Mario also mentioned the contributions they make to ecosystem services. There's organic fertilizer coming from livestock, which is being reused within those mixed crop livestock farms. And then it's also a big cultural issue. And that's one of the things that when the topic of livestock comes up within the agriculture stream of climate negotiations, it becomes a very contentious issue because for many communities within Africa, numbers of livestock are culturally important, and any suggestion that they reduce those numbers really is met with just a flat out no, because it's not something that they want to consider, not only because it's important culturally, but also, you know, it's needed for meeting the food security, nutrition, all of those things that I've said. So, you know, we're feeling those impacts within the negotiations. We also have had some trouble even getting funding to do research on livestock development. The donors for a long time were reluctant because there was this negative perception of livestock's impact on the climate. And so that kind of hampered our ability to raise money for the research that would help these farmers improve their livestock keeping. So it's something that we've been working on. We want to help add nuance to the debate and really highlight that the production systems, like Mario was saying, they are so diverse, and the industrialized production systems of the global north are really so different than what is happening in Africa. And he also mentioned land use and the issue of, you know, a lot of the land here is not suitable for crop farming. 80% of Kenyan land is semi-arid or arid. And so really, you know, unless there are huge investments in irrigation, which, you know, there are some, but it's not nearly on a scale that would make that land suitable for crop farming, the best use of that land is pastoralism and livestock farming. So, you know, I see the debate as really kind of having negative impacts on these livestock keepers. And what we're trying to do is, you know, bring the science from all the evidence where we see how climate change is negatively impacting livestock keepers. They're, you know, having reductions in production because of heat stress, and Mario and another colleague have done a lot of work on that. And so we see that, you know, unless we act, unless we get adaptation options into the hands of livestock keepers, they're going to really suffer. And then the economy and the nutrition and everything else will suffer as well. And so we're working with the negotiators to give them the evidence so that they can kind of, really argue as to why livestock is important and why it should be part of a climate solution. Because a lot of the options within livestock, and I think Anne and Guyo may speak a little bit more about this, is that, you know, things that we do for adaptation will have mitigation co-benefits. So that is one of the things where, you know, we really think that by working within the livestock sector, we can help people reduce poverty rates, we can improve nutrition, and we can do that in an environmentally sustainable way. So I think I'll leave it there and hand it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Perhaps we can move on now to Guyo.
Thank you, Tara, and thank you for having me. And in this very interesting debate that we've been grappling with for the last, I think, 2 or 3 years. Every time we go to COP, we tend to confront this question very regularly. I think as my bio shows, I work with the International Livestock Research Institute. I'm heading an international research collaboration called the Jamil Observatory for Food Security Early Action, which largely work in the pastoral and agro-pastoral areas around building data evidence for early warning, early action in a drought-affected countries, which include Kenya, Somalia, and Ethiopia. In addition to that, I also come from pastoralist community from the north, and so I have stronger positionality on some of these issues from working and also coming from there. I think enough of that. So for me, I think the debate is quite it's quite timely, but then also interestingly a very polarized debate in our space. And the reason for that, when you look at the pattern of how the debate evolved, basically when you want to develop a pattern, a narrative, you build evidence around it. And I think the big issue in our area is the evidence is very patchy. Nobody up to today can tell you the carbon, what do you call it, the footprint of livestock systems within an extensive pastoral systems. And when you do that, actually, and you use basically some of the pieces of the northern livestock narrative on an extensive system, then you homogenize very complex systems. So when you homogenize the complex systems, then you simplify a system that it's very complex. So for me, I think the three things which are worrying in this particular debate is that, one, I think the evidence is very patchy, and we're very far away from building this stronger evidence around the extensive livestock system, which is the pastoral systems. The second, I think, is oversimplifying, basically, which means that the diversity and the difference in the production system from the cultural, livelihood, environmental, and production method is really vast. So when you use the same production framing and thinking on different systems, then you tend to again fall into the same narrative. And the third, I think, which is now emerging very strongly in this region through DONA and other groups, is the push for reducing your herd size. And of course, also by extension, a wholesale push around dietary shift away from meat. And this is really troubling. If you come from the pastoral area where your main food and the main system is the livestock, then this debate actually worries you quite much. So I think for me, so the entire shift is how do we build evidence around these issues so that we have a more balanced, informed decision. And some of our research work currently that is going on at ILRI through the postdoc and PhD is building on some of this gap, looking at the feed, evaluating feed composition, farmer practices, and how does that affect the contribution of greenhouse gas within a semi-intensive system for now. But then transferring that to an extensive system, which is based on mobility, is a different thing. So still the research is evolving very strongly around that, but then we're very far from building that particular data and evidence. And secondly, in the work we do, which is around range work and adaptation work within pastoral systems, there are of course very clear evidence because of how the production system is structured based on mobility, using extensive landscape based on heterogeneity of the resources. Basically, it means that there are evidence ecologically and in other pieces of streams of data that the pastoral systems or agro-pastoral systems have the smallest impact in terms of greenhouse gas emission. But this doesn't have quantifiable, very straight data that shows that this is what it is in this country, and this is what does it show in the entire picture. So one of our aim within ILRI and institution that works partner with ILRI is how do we build evidence around two things. One, I think, as the climatic conditions shift, the form of pastoralism, the livestock number, the species diversity of these animals have been shifting drastically. And there's not much research which has shown how does this shift impact people, how does it impact environment and the ecology and biodiversity. This is still a gray area that requires a bit of attention. The second area is actually the voices of those who are affected by this debate is missing on the table. Essentially, I don't see any pastoralist within COP conversation and other conversation. So if you miss from the table, it means that the benefit of the kind of alternative you choose, the cost of that alternative, and the impact of that alternative is made without your voice. And so for us within the policy, livelihood, and institution team within ILRI is also to look at these policy questions. How do we prevent using data, use of the blanket policy around system that is not very compatible. So for me, these are the key areas and takeaway from this discussion. And it's a very interesting area, but then we have a long way to go in terms of building evidence and building research around this issue within the extensive southern livestock system. So for now, we're still using the northern narrative on the southern livestock, according to my, I think, summary. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. And so now I'll just turn over to Anne.
Thank you very much, Tara, and table colleagues from ILRI and Cornell. I think let me start by just echoing what colleagues have already said, that also from where I sit, I feel the debate lacks nuance. We don't really look at the differences in systems. Each of these systems comes with very different issues, very different opportunities also. And as also colleagues have already mentioned, the debate is polarized. So there is, and it doesn't seem to improve, which is really worrying, because as much as, for example, Guyo says, we need more evidence, we need to understand better. At a certain point, if people don't listen to each other, then the evidence is also not put into use. So I feel it's really important that we kind of break that polarization. And it goes in a little bit in two directions, I feel. So it's in the north, for example, people feel that we should not really invest in livestock, as Laura already said. But also in the south, people really go a little bit in the defensive, and there is a lack of willingness to listen to maybe other pathways for livestock sector development. So that's really polarization that worries me actually really a lot. And then in terms of what I really think are the key issues, I think climate change has been mentioned a lot already. Another big one from my point of view is biodiversity loss. It's really huge, and it will, and as mentioned before, livestock is a big land user, so this kind of comes with impacts on biodiversity also. So I think those are for me two big ones, without forgetting, of course, the other planetary boundaries and some of the tipping points that are coming our way. So just to say that I feel there is some urgency, and that's also maybe why the debate is polarized, because a lot of people feel there is urgency and therefore go into maybe some almost a panic mode. So that's from the environmental point of view, but I think we can also really not forget that we also still have very persistent poverty levels, food and nutrition insecurity. We have a growing inequality. So it's a very complex problem. So we all feel we need urgent solutions, but it's very complex. So if the problem is complex, also the solution cannot be simple or simplistic. And so that brings us back to the debate, is sometimes overly simplistic and maybe not build enough on the evidence that we're trying to build as researchers and heterogeneous in a different system. There is a slightly different tweak here. But anyway, so yeah, we can't not have simplistic solutions. So I don't think we can say we have to all stop eating animal-sourced food, but reductions in consumptions in certain places and avoiding the same pathway in the developed countries, in the developing countries, as where it went in the developed countries, has a place in the solution. It has to be part of the solution. Reducing losses and waste has to be part of the solution, and it can be in terms of increasing the circularity of the systems, but it can also, yeah, it can take many different forms. So we really need to do part of that. And then, yes, as been mentioned before, we also have to improve what is produced has to be produced in an as efficient way possible in the places where it makes more sense, where we have less of an opportunity cost. So we should really think in that sense, I think. Okay, I had taken some notes because I tend to ramble a little bit, but yeah, I don't think I mentioned yet what I actually work on. So I have two quite different strands of work. My own kind of technical background is more in spatial and systems analysis, and I apply quite a lot of that into designing and applying tools for environmental footprint calculations. So trying to really look at different scales, at the farm scale, at the landscape scale, even at country scale. What is the current environmental footprint what happens in different scenarios, so that you try and feed these insights into decisions, and try and put the livestock sector development on a pathway that is hopefully different from what we've seen in the developed countries. So that's one part of my own technical work, and I'm also coordinating actually a group of people that really use cultivated forages as an entry point for making a livestock production more efficient. So on that part of the solution around making the production, what you produce, as efficient as possible, and then looking at in which instances does cultivated forages make sense, where do you grow that, and then also building the evidence around what difference does it make. Let me stop there for now.
Thank you. That was extremely interesting. So thank you so much for all your contributions. I think I might kick off with some reflections and then some questions. I think you have all made a very, very strong case for the importance in multiple ways of the livestock sector in sub-Saharan Africa, and your concerns that there has been a kind of simplification and a homogenization of the narrative, and that people in Kenya and more broadly in Africa feel under attack. I guess I have some questions. I think Mario has also articulated very powerfully the kind of the global situation where we have a globally major contribution to land use, to climate change, and to the biodiversity loss that Anne was talking about. So I guess and you have all made the point that different parts of the world, different priorities, different needs, different responsibilities. So my question to you really is, what do you see to be the responsibilities of the global north, both in A, getting its own house in order when it comes to the livestock sector, and B, helping countries in sub-Saharan Africa on a pathway that is both equitable and also is going to adapt to and mitigate the environmental impacts of livestock production. So really, what do people like me have to do sitting in London, and what do we have to do for you? Whoever wants to start.
I can say something.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I think, as I already mentioned, I think there is a lot of overconsumption. So some kind of continuing on the path, I think that is starting there to reduce consumption, and and reducing losses, I think, is really important in the north, and probably also trying to keep an open mind to the differences and the importance of livestock for people, and that not every livestock production system is as detrimental as an industrial system. So trying to get that nuance in there, and advocating for continued investment, because there is really a lack of investment in the south. So, but these are maybe not new points, so let me see what others can add.
And just to push on that, because I think Laura has mentioned it as well, and Guyo, that you have seen a measurable drop in investment. Is that a perception? Is that reality? How do you sort of think about that?
Yeah, let me come in. Yes, I think it is a reality. I used to work with IFAD before I went to ILRI, and in IFAD, I think there was actually almost an official policy of not putting money in cattle particularly. And I think all the design were encouraged to push investment towards small ruminants and others. And I think this is the buildup of how much the narrative could build into from that end to the global south, where I think the production system, where I come from in my village, a most resilient person to climate change is someone who has all the portfolios of livestock, from sheep and goat, cow, camel. So if you don't invest in one of them, then your resilience level is almost dropped by a third. So, and that's the reality. The moment you use that, so I've seen clearly, of course, this keeps on coming and going. Of course, sometimes gender comes up. Importantly, sometimes the climate issue comes up. But I think on that, I've seen particularly that. But I think what the global south should do, I think what Anne said is very important in terms of setting the path towards this sustainability. It's a very important one, and of course, clearly documenting some of the lessons that are transferable to our context. That's important. But the second also is, I think, as I said, I think we really need more evidence to set a path of decision and being on the table, because Agnes, which is African Group of Negotiators, could not negotiate in any COP because of lack of that particular side of data. It's not there. So they only appeal to the emotions of the people who are within the South, who depend on livestock 100% for their livelihood. So I think more sort of investment and better positioning of these, so that people build on some of the key salutary lessons that come from the North to work on their own system as they gradually move up the ladder. I think as they graduate from certain point in their poverty scale to the next level is very important.
Thank you. Mary, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, I want to come in because, I think that, as Anne said, we need to increase investment, but it's not increase investment to do the same. It's not the same development projects that we were doing 10, 15 years ago. It's really, more integrated development projects that truly incorporate an environmental dimension. I don't think that we are in a position to really just say, well, more livestock is better. I would say, or reducing emission intensities by increasing yield is enough, which is a rhetoric that most donors have. We really need to work on, okay, let's maintain or increase production, but let's reduce the footprint, and let's do it with a smaller footprint livestock sector. We cannot keep promoting the increases in animal numbers as people actually don't make explicit in many of their development of their development strategies. And I think that that's something really important. We need to be more credible and much more upfront about trying to achieve this version of sustainable intensification, reducing the size of the livestock herd, particularly for the ruminants.
So, Mario, just one thing. You have talked a lot about sustainable intensification. Others have mentioned the word industrialization. Can you make clear for all of us the distinction as you see it between the two concepts?
Well, here I'm using it as a land-based concept. But for example, you and I wrote that part of sustainable intensification is including high welfare standards, ensuring that we're also talking about ways of controlling pollution in industrial systems, having more humane systems. So those forms, industrial production will have to play a role because of the high efficiency gains. But it has a place, it has a context. And if somebody asks me, is it either or? Is it industrial production or is it a more agroecological? It's not about dogmas. Both things have a place in our food system, and both will be required, both will be consumed by different kinds of consumers, and will make use of resources differently. So, it's not, we need to stop juxtaposing systems against each other. We need all forms of production almost at this stage. But, we need to really, especially when it comes to sub-Saharan Africa, you know, this concept that more is better always, it's not the case. We can't advocate just a continuation of current trends, especially in land use and in the way the development projects have been implemented in the past.
Thank you. It was Anne and Laura, and I can't remember who put their hands up first. So why don't one of you start, and perhaps up to
Yeah,
you.
I'll start. I think responding to your question about what should the global north do and what can the global south do, I think reading the comment in the chat about the power dynamics within that, I think one of the main things, Anne said people in the global north where there is overconsumption should be reducing their consumption. I think they should also be educating themselves about what livestock production systems are like in the global south. I was at COP27 and a pro-veg, vegetarian activist kind of came up in our event and asked a question, almost suggesting, and I think Guyo, you were on this panel, or no, it was Dereje, really suggesting that pastoralists just should settle down and, kind of buy tofu from their local supermarket. I'm exaggerating, but it was showing really a lack of understanding of what it is like to live in a semi-arid area and rely on livestock for your livelihood and your food source and everything else. So it's, I do feel like there just needs to be more education in the global north so that kind of understanding can come through without kind of saying, well, let's just let everybody eat all the meat they want. But, there has to be some equity considerations as well. If people, need a certain amount of animal source foods to have a healthy diet, then we have to look at what are the demographic trends within Africa and what production levels do we need to get there. So, I think we'll talk more maybe about the emissions versus emissions intensities and things like that. But I just wanted to add that in. Thanks.
And you were going to come in.
Yeah, I think it was in response to something Mario said, but maybe it makes sense also after Laura's intervention. I really feel like there is an opportunity in the South to avoid the mistakes that were done in the North. So, and it has to, as much as yes, the consumption levels in the South are really much lower, and some kids need an egg or they need a glass of milk, but I think we also have to be aware and start saying this, maybe also in the South, like we don't want to go on the same path. Yes, there are equity issues, but let us also try and educate people in the South already now about what are healthy diets and avoid what is the automatic almost response of people when they get a little bit better off. They increase meat consumption to levels that are not healthy, that are not necessary. So I think we also need to really think in that sense. And it's the big opportunity, actually. It's an opportunity that we can learn what went wrong there, what went wrong by disconnecting land and animals, because that is also a really big problem. It's when you start disconnecting the land and the animal that you have all kinds of problems with pollution, the manure. Look at Netherlands and Belgium. The farmers are on the street because it's a serious issue. So, and if we are not careful, and that's my definition of sustainable intensification. Yes, we can intensify the systems, but let us try and look forward, like what are some of the threads of this intensification and how can we do it differently? How do we keep that connection between land and animal? Does it mean that we have to build a manure value chain? But so, yeah, anyway, enough for me.
Thank you. So I'm going to turn to another question that I think it's a I think it's a big question and it might be a little bit difficult, but this word culture is one that we in Britain as well talk about and struggle with a lot when it comes to livestock and land use and the role of farming and our diets, because of course any land-based activity has a huge amount of history and culture and identity all bound up in it. And when there is change that is either needing to happen, being thrust upon you, certain groups advocating for it, it's often said that this is my culture, this is my way of being. So obviously, I think the issues in the UK are not, they're not existential in the sense that there is some social safety net, however inadequate, but it is an issue in Britain. And so we are trying to navigate as a kind of community how to think about change and how to think about tradition, bearing in mind that things do change. So in light of that kind of reflection, how do you think about this question of culture and pastoralism and livestock numbers and more broadly farming? I think Guyo, I'm going to suggest.
Okay, no. I was waiting for one of my colleagues to jump in. Yeah, I think it's okay. Two parts to that question. First, I think the cultural part is, I think it's very important to put it very straight. Pastoralism, I think, is not a cultural thing. It's actually is a production system. It's a livelihood system based on extensive livestock production. And the culture becomes secondary if you look at it from that point. Pastoralism happened in a land which is not homogeneous landscape. It's a heterogeneous landscape. And the way you exploit this heterogeneity is through strategic mobility across different landscapes. So the cultural part is that depending on the community you come from, I come from predominantly cattle keeping community. There's a long history of, if you amass more animals, you have more influence in the society, and you make a number of decisions based on the number of livestock you have. But that's very, very old school. I think it has really now moved because of emergence of school and other options for people to make a decision in their village. But then the narrative and the literature did not shift from that historical part. So for me, I think the important thing is that it's very hard to divorce the pastoralists from the livestock, for obvious reason that it's an integral part of them. And that's why I talk about the resilience to shock is how many diversity of animals you have. There's a gradual shift. I think the cattle population is almost, I think, non-existent. I come from a family that has 700 cows when I was young, but now we barely make 100 cows. But then it has shifted to small ruminants. You have more sheep and goat. You have more camel. You're embracing all these things. So culturally, we are more around cattle traditionally, but now we're embracing other things because of the reality of the changes and the demands and dictates of the climate. So that historical part and the cultural part is still there, but then it's not as bad as people saying. People keep animals in idleness, and that the more you have, the more influence you have, and you hold to this because of cultural significance. This is not true. People don't hold to a livestock because of cultural significance. People sell animals. Actually, some of the people in the livestock commercialization use that narrative and say, we need to orient pastoralists to market. It's not like that. It's actually people have moved. There is a need for disposing of your animals depending on all these things that people face. So in the climatic shocks and everything, you have a portfolio of livestock going almost up and down. And the struggle within the pastoralists now is how do you have a healthy portfolio of animals to face subsequent shock, which is almost becoming a common thing in the Horn of Africa. So in summary, yes, culture is very integral part of how people keep livestock, but then it's not the sole reason. It's actually, there's a production system that has culture embedded and ingrained within that. Thank you.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Does anyone else want to come in on that question?
Well,
I think
maybe I want to just repeat what Guyo said earlier on, that, well, first of all, maybe it's dynamic. Africa has a very young population. So I think culture is very dynamic and probably in sub-Saharan Africa more dynamic than you can imagine in most European countries. So I think what Guyo describes is typical. Things are moving and things are changing. But having said that, people still from the communities, from the different types of communities, depending on different types of production systems, have to have their voices at the table. I think that is really important, and that still really needs some more work, I think.
Yeah.
Anyone else want to come in on that?
Yeah, I think I'm kind of looking at the first question that was addressed to me about mitigation co-benefits. If maintaining number of animals remains a priority for producers with a large number of low producing animals. So, looking at what Guyo was saying about, yes, there are a large number of animals. To someone else's outside perspective, they might be low producing, but for Guyo and for his, other pastoralists, they are resilient. They are hardy. When, there isn't enough vegetation, they can survive. It's how you look at it, whether it's a low producing animal or a really well adapted and resilient animal. And so I think there are, within different production systems, we can feed animals better to reduce those emissions intensities. And then you're having, those mitigation co-benefits because the amount of emissions per unit of milk or meat is going down. But it's also just how are we looking at the animals and what animals are they? And what kind of label are we putting on them? So it's, I think we do have to look, and this is getting back to the culture now, we have to look beyond what are the emissions coming out of those animals and look at what other kind of services are coming from those animals as well. Thanks.
So I have one more question before we move to the actual the questions in the chat, and that is about urban as well as rural populations, and I guess the trends towards urbanization. How do you see the issues with respect to production systems and consumption patterns and consumption trajectories and their implications? How do you see the differences there? Mary, you look like you were about to say something.
Well, sorry, I was so busy answering the questions in the chat.
Okay, I will repeat the question. It was basically about the processes of urbanization and the differing consumption patterns and production kind of feeding systems that underlie them. How do you see the issues and the priorities and the risks there? I mean,
well, that's an important question because things are changing and are becoming obviously more urbanized. Many of the systems are turning into peri-urban systems with land being used for all sorts of things. Land values are changing, etc. And the key here is, how will this affect the provision, for example, of feed? Feed is such a crucial element of this intensification pathway that we tend to advocate for increasing yields and everything. So for me, the feed sourcing side of things is essentially important, and also treating things as packages. You still see some donors, focusing on crossbreeding a lot, but they don't have the ancillary project on getting the feed for those crossbred animals. We need to think of packages and packages that make sense for the different locations. In fact, I was actually just answering a question that is in the Q&A from Lasse Brun precisely about this, that what should we be doing to actually reduce the numbers of animals but maintaining output? And yes, the key is a large part of the equation is better feeding. Even if we start with the existing animals, And then you can actually start moving towards crossbreeding and a range of other things. But I think this is going to be, well, it's always been like the Achilles heel of intensifying livestock, and especially in mixed crop livestock systems where farmers, are risk averse in many cases, and they still want their patches of maize and beans and a range of other things, and compromising staples for planting more fodder is a sensitive decision for them. So we need to find ways of increasing feed. Well, gladly Anne has it all sussed out at SIAD with the improved forages that they promote.
Okay, I'm going to move on to some of the questions in the chat. So I've got one here from Charlotte Hall, which is, I would be interested to know the speaker's thoughts on how much consideration should be given to animal welfare in these kinds of debates, because it feels that it's very rarely mentioned. Why is this? There's been some discussion of increasing production with a smaller land footprint. Is this a suggestion of more intensive production? If so, how can we justify this in terms of animal welfare?
Can I give it an initial shot to that?
Yes.
Well, a lot of people, when you mention in an intensive system, and when people think about this, you imagine a sow in a crate or hens in battery or a high yielding cow almost not being able to move. But in reality, in the majority of sub-Saharan Africa, we are far from that. Still, in many cases, when we talk about intensification, is really moving animals that are producing between 2 to 5 liters of milk to trying to produce 10 or 15. It's something that we obviously have to consider always, the welfare of the animal. But for the intensification that we're talking about is still no way near what we see, say, to an intensive system in an OECD country, and that's something important to think about, because there's still so much room for improvement within adequate welfare standards, that we're not talking here about caged animals and things like that in tiny spaces, or big encroachment of animals in a single location. It's still much more within the feasible productions, within the production system that farmers have at the moment.
And how much is animal welfare a focus within ILRI, within SIAT, in your work?
From the SIAT side, is not high on the agenda. I think we are aware, but it's not like we have a strand of work on that. But as Mario said, it's probably because the issue of animal welfare is not as blatant as you see in some of the really very intensive systems. Like some of the systems we are working on is in silvopastoral systems, where you really actually the welfare of the animals goes up because you're protecting them from the heat by providing more shade. You're kind of really making sure the rotational grazing works well, they're fed well, they're in better shape. But yeah, I think it's on it. We know it's an issue, and we are keeping an eye, but we should probably do a little more on it. With partners, I would say, because we don't have the expertise in-house either.
And from an ILRI perspective?
I think, if you would categorize improved feeding so that animals aren't, underfed, and improving health through delivery of vaccines and things like that, if you categorize those as animal welfare, I would say we are working on it, but it's not in the sense like Mario was saying of, trying to give them more space, because they do have, most animals being raised here are raised with plenty of space.
Thank you. I have another question. I have a question here from Margot Monio, who says, I understand the concerns regarding simplifying discussions about livestock farming. The carbon footprint of southern systems has nothing to do with those of northern systems. But what about deforestation leading to desertification in sub-Saharan African areas, particularly due to transhuman pastoral farming? By constantly comparing southern systems and extolling their virtues, are we not overlooking certain battles? Thank you. So I think that was a question that maybe that there are issues around within pastoralism. Perhaps you could speak to that.
Okay, this is maybe in Africa, I think we don't have one uniform pastoral mode. And I think every pastoralist, I think, including where I come from, have a very deep-seated governance and system for managing land. Just to give you an example, where I come from, you're not supposed to, in regulation, you're not supposed to cut an acacia tree. You can use a branch of an acacia tree. That is rule number one. Basically, to fence your animals, to do other things. You cannot bring down an entire tree for purposes of fencing and creating a cow shed and etc. And this historical way of using land, because of the significance of species within that area, acacia pods are one of the most nutritious products that people use in times of transition, in times of drought and etc. So by that virtue, as a young herder, you are taken through that kind of pupillage, and it becomes very integral part of the way you look at environment. So, but then there may be other systems where this kind of governance will be weakened. And this weakening also is from states sometimes, which create parallel institutions to manage pastoral areas, creating committees that have no presence on the ground and taking powers from those who have presence on the ground and make them not legal. So all this mismatch is what is contributing to a situation where if you have an observed shift in forage cover or tree covers, then that could be a contributing factor. Definitely, I think it's a very valid question. If there's a presence or prominence of deforestation that is countering how people use land, but all the places from the West Africa to the Horn of Africa where I've actually worked, there's a very interesting complementarity between how people use land and how they keep their livestock, really, because a tree is important for camel. If it's not important for cow, then it's important for camel and sheep and goat. So that takes me back to taking care of your portfolio of animals. And by that, you have to take care of that particular trees. So it's not a very big significant problem in pastoral areas because one, the forest cover is not so much confined to the, we have shrubs and other kind of vegetation, but not very deep forest. Where this has been commercialized is in what we call high potential area, the mountain areas where there's more farming and people tend to commercialize, timber and etc. than within the pastoral system where these things are seen completely different from how people look at timber as a value product.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to add anything to that or try and move on? Okay, so here are two questions on technology. So one is from Santiago Farina. Given the example of crossbreeding or AI breeding in general as a quick adoption technology, but not coupled with practices to sustain those animals, such as feeding, welfare, health practices, how could we, meaning organizations, private and public, help to increase adoption of process-intensive technologies focused on the management, not on the actual inputs or equipments? So...
Yeah. Can I go for that one? I was actually asking them and answering it on the chat.
Okay, well then you've got a plan.
Yeah, so Santiago, yeah, thanks for the question. It's a very interesting one, and it is something that I think that all the organizations working on livestock development need to rethink, because I think that we've lost a huge element of husbandry as part of development. We've actually tend to focus way too much on technological improvements. And the way that we used to do this before was to have really big capacity building components in our institutions, training extension agents, training a range of other people, doing a lot more direct farmer training and things like that. And you have seen those things almost disappear completely from the budgets and portfolios of most development organizations. So it is sometimes donor pushed, but it is sometimes, a change of strategy. But I think that this is something that we need to revisit because, well, as you rightly point, husbandry management practices are potentially an equally important way of increasing the productivity of the systems that we work. And once you have that, that's kind of knowledge that, that doesn't disappear like many technologies. So, I think that we need to make the case for better and bigger training programs. Tara, you're muted.
I'm scrolling to try and find a question. Here we are. A question here from Ken Giller, who asks, a lot of the discussion is rightly focused on ruminants, yet maybe we need to think a bit more about poultry and other small livestock that are very important. We see a massive increase in poultry and aquaculture in many African countries driven by urbanization, provides an opportunity for smallholders to produce soybean as feed, which can work well as a form of sustainable intensification through diversifying cereal-based farming. But there are more negative sides because often battery farming approaches are used. So his question is, in the Netherlands, he says, where he's based, we desperately need to reduce the amount of landless meat production of poultry and pigs that is simply driven by imported soy feed from South America, with the products, meat and egg, exported and the manure left behind. But what do you make of the argument that reducing poultry production in Europe will simply shift the environmental footprint?
Yes, in many cases, absolutely. You will end up with a lot of leakage, especially if you're going to try to support the growth rates in consumption that many of these places have. It would be great if we could find options to be able to grow that feed or that soybean locally rather than having imported from, high biodiversity regions where soybean is produced. I mean, chopping rainforest or doing land use changes in highly diverse pastures to grow soybean. If you're going to produce that poultry in Africa instead, you're just moving the problem. Even if you move it from the Netherlands. So if we could get local production systems, actually with the feed coming from the nearby region, it would be a hell of a lot better.
Okay. Goya, do you want to come in? Does anyone else want to come in on the non-ruminant livestock and also small ruminants, I guess, as well? And the aquaculture issue as well, which I think, we hear a lot about the fact that aquaculture gets ignored in discussions about food systems. So something on that would be very useful.
I'm not sure whether I'm the right person to answer this question because I started eating my first fish like 5-10 years ago. So I think the most on the important side, yes, I think there's a structural shift necessitated by the climatic event towards more ruminants in where I work, really, and less on the aquaculture because of the cultural element you said, because it really takes an entire process, shifting your production from one species of animal to the other. But I think that doesn't mean that there is no shift towards poultry. I think within pastoral area, there's quite a number of poultry initiative embraced over the last 20 years. And I think, unfortunately, the statistic in Africa is very bad that we don't even have species aggregate level data on what number of poultry do you have in a particular space? Even all the cows that you have, nobody is in a position to count and tell us how many there are. We just hear that there are many and you have to reduce them. But that's beside the point. The point is that there's two things which is happening in the last 15, 20 years. One is there's this structural shift, production shift towards small ruminants. This is very clear. The poultry is being embraced, but agriculture is largely really constrained by the ecology. Unless you have a watershed or a river, a lake somewhere in a pocket where people who are riverine population tend to embrace this, but then also because all these areas are in a very isolated pockets, very far away, the level of commercialization is very bad. And given that the fish is very perishable, then it really is confined to either dried fish and etc. But then there's huge potential for this particular food, supply chain or value chain to be developed further. And I think as people tend to go to more seeking education and getting exposure to different things, we'll definitely, I think, embrace that at some point. But for now, I think in my area where I come from and the pastoral places where I work, is very limited investment in that level.
Thank you. Does anyone want to say anything more on either of those two, the aquaculture or the poultry, or?
Well, I don't really know anything about aquaculture, so I can't say a lot.
Right.
But I think what Uyo kind of answer points to is that so if you shift to non-ruminants, often you also shift to a different feed resource, which is then more grains, which are often grown on land that is also very suitable for food production, whereas the ruminants have the advantage that some of their grasses and legumes are easier to grow on in areas that are not so well suited for food production.
Yeah, absolutely. The key would be, there's, poultry are incredibly good recyclers. And, you could do a lot with circular feed or food waste to feed those animals. But yeah, we need to avoid the food feed competition at all costs. Yeah. But, with poultry, it's very, very simple interventions that actually help increase productivity significantly. First, try for them not to die. And, typically Newcastle disease is one very useful one. And then, if you do a little super simple shed or a way of increasing a little bit of housing, it really tends to work wonders. Yeah.
Thank you. So, got a question here from Yen Nguyen, and sorry, I haven't pronounced it properly, who asks about One Health. The question is, I'm very interested in the theme from the One Health initiative, the sustainable linkage between food chain, livestock, and the environment, especially in the climate change impacts. May I ask your opinion about the whole? It's a question about the One Health concept and whether you find it a useful one. And perhaps one of you could also define it for audience members who might not be familiar with the concept.
I'll give it a go
Go for it.
since no one else is jumping forward. But, to give a disclaimer at the beginning, I'm not a One Health expert. ILRI does have a One Health center and a lot of actual experts on this topic. So maybe I'll put the link in the chat when we're done here. But so One Health is this approach where you're looking at human health, animal health, and environmental health all together. So looking at food safety concerns of animal source foods, looking at zoonotic diseases, and then looking at the environmental impact as well, the environmental health. So, I think it is a useful approach to kind of also just think about how can we improve these systems? How can we reduce, foodborne diseases for people? How can we prevent animals from dying? Because of course, if animals die from disease, then if they're ruminants, all their emissions have gone to waste, essentially, if it was, a meat animal. And so I think it is a useful approach to look at, and it's something that probably will become more important. I mean, one of the questions earlier was about urbanization, and I think we can't deny that there are urban and peri-urban livestock within the cities now, and we need to think about how that can be improved. Mario was talking about poultry production and the circular economy opportunities there. So I think there's kind of scope for looking at, things like he was saying, food waste. So that can also improve or reduce emissions, although food waste is quite low within Africa. But it's an approach that I think can help, and really, it does look at that environmental side of things as well. So I would say it is useful, but I don't know if Anne or Guyo or Mario wants to add. Thanks.
Yes, I can add. Yeah, I think it's as a frame, as a concept, is a very useful one. Especially, I think it gained traction after COVID and all these things, and somehow I think also really because of the COVID shock, we were somehow pushed to that space to think about this. But I think for me, it becomes more useful if we can operationalize the concept. What does that mean? Already we're struggling with animal health, human health, and environmental health within the area where we work in dryland areas. So if it changes the frame of how people design the intervention, it becomes useful. If it changes how resources flow across the three, it becomes very useful. So as a concept, it's very nice, and I think it packs. There's a very compelling reason for that. But then, how does that distill into the actual operation? What does that mean? Is the leg that actually makes it more useful to answer, I think, his question. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. So I've got a question here from, unless you wanted to say something, Mario, were you about to say something? No. Okay.
No, I'm okay.
Okay. The question here from Rachel Sherrington, who is actually Hazel Healy, because I think Hazel is using, anyway, that doesn't matter. I often hear representatives from industrial high polluting meat producers, e.g. at COP28, effectively blaming climate change on low productive systems, effectively the global south. The argument is put across by people linked to meat corporations in the US that are some of the most polluting companies of Earth and where methane emissions are rising. So I think the phrase that they sometimes use is that 80% of emissions come from low or medium production systems. Rachel Hazel is saying that she thinks this is a very misleading bad faith argument and would love to know your how you would respond to the argument. I mean, I think you've alluded to it already in your in what you've said, but perhaps you could, talk about that apparent discrepancy in emissions intensity between the more intensive global north systems, industrialized systems, and those in the global south. How would you respond?
I would say that that's a super misleading statistic. Simply because, the 80%, you don't really know if they're talking about an operation size or if they're talking of an OECD versus a low and middle income country. What I can tell you is that low and middle income country systems will produce about 55% of emissions. So in reality, it's 50-50, but that's a geographical comparison. That's not that doesn't tell you anything about systems and their level of intensity. And, the focus that they tend to do is, they're just focusing on emissions intensities. They think that they're super efficient because they produce at low greenhouse gas emissions per kilo of product. But that's only part of the solution, as we know. That doesn't lead to any mitigation whatsoever, because it's really about the gross emissions, what you want to tackle. So, it's one of the many ways that, you know, large companies actually use information for their benefit. You know, there's all this discredit, you know, creating a nebulous message around the numbers, and that really confuses all sorts of audiences.
So basically, I think what you're, among other things, what you're saying, Mario, is that these very industrialized systems, the gross emissions are so high because they produce meat so cheaply, which fuels demand, which keeps the system going and expanding. Is that partly what the argument you're making? Yeah. Who else would like to come in on that comment, on that question, rather?
I mean, I think I would also just kind of agree with Mario that there are a lot of confusing statistics out there, and people can kind of use them in lots of different ways. And it isn't always easy to get to where it's coming from. You know, are they talking about life cycle analysis? Are they talking about simply production? It's really hard to know and to compare. And then, as Guya was saying earlier, we don't really have accurate data from the global south, and especially from Africa. So, you know, even to make those comparisons, if you have the numbers, it's, you know, kind of questionable where those numbers came from. So it's, yeah, I think it is always important to look at who's putting forth the numbers and what they're using them to say. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, so if nobody's got any further comments on that specific question, I think in the last 5 minutes, I'd just like to invite each of you to speak for about a minute on anything else you would like to really say, to get across. And I think also just to kind of bear in mind this sort of north-south difference in approach to the livestock issue. And I think if I were speaking in the voice of an environmental NGO from the global north, most of them would say that the target of their concern is not pastoral communities in sub-Saharan Africa. It is industrialized systems and the consumption patterns of the affluent global northern citizens. So I guess, where has that disconnect in perception of who is saying and arguing and thinking what come across, and how can that be kind of clarified in ways that are going to be better for people and for the environment, and indeed for livestock? I hope you've understood my question there. So it was a bit garbled.
I can try and answer something, and then you can let us know if it was to the right question.
Okay.
So yeah, what I think maybe as a last word want to say is that I think there is a lot to do around livestock, and rightfully so. They have a big environmental footprint. But I think if you look at the global south or sub-Saharan Africa, there is really an opportunity here to put it on a different pathway, so we can learn what the strategies and the development in the north. And I think there is a lot of kind of young, smart people that are ready to change things, because there is a need to change things, not only from an environmental point of view, but really people need to go ahead, and they want to go ahead. So I think we really need to tap into that opportunity and help people to improve the efficiency of the system, so that we don't have to listen to crazy statistics that are a little unfair to start with, but also that there is really no ground for that anymore. And I think it's possible.
Thank you. Mario?
Yeah, I've been thinking what I want to say, and you know, it's probably along the same lines as Anne. You know, we have we've had successful examples of transitions in the past in some countries, you know, so we know it's actually possible in many cases to have reductions in the size of the livestock sector. But what I would like to say is that, you know, we are now at a place where you know it's an irrefutable need to also work on environmental aspects of the sector, even in low and middle income countries. There is less of a place just for arguing of the needed increases in consumption as you know, just as a given that are needed in sub-Saharan Africa. It needs to be really within achieving those within environmental bounds, really thinking of a transition that will be different to what we did in the past. It's just super needed. And, you know, we also need to think that the systems are really changing. There's so much off-farm income. There's so much, you know, the changes in education are very, very significant. A lot of these farmers are already sending their kids to school at unprecedented rates. And, you know, the next generation might have different views of what they want to do. And this will impinge in how the systems will look like in the future as well.
Okay, I'm sorry, I've got like 20 seconds for Laura and Guyo. Sorry, be concise, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think for the global north, you know, an environmental NGO or something there, I would say just try to be more specific in the messaging. It is a good thing to try to reduce meat consumption, but you know, don't kind of lump everyone together. And then for the global south, you know, I think countries do need to look at and do some long-term planning and do some kind of good foresight of the trends and where things are going. And like Anne was saying, don't make the same mistakes, and let's not get into the lifestyle diseases that we find in the north and in the environmental problems and everything else. So I think, you know, charting our own way forward and doing it in an environmentally sustainable way, it can be done. Thanks.
Thank you. Guyo, I'm going to give you the last word.
Okay, thank you very much. I think the conversation is very important, and I think we all evidently agree the impact of livestock footprint on the climatic debate. But I think my point is on the metrics. I think we need a trade-off on the kind of metrics we use. I think the application of singular metrics around efficiency, around per capita contribution of an animal, and etc. It could be sometimes not the best way. I think if you have sort of like a full cost analysis that takes into consideration a number of things, then so it's the most important in my sense. We need to evolve our matrix so that we start believing in numbers. So because the numbers could be very misleading, and it informs policy, and then the blanket policy would inform investment, and all these things are so much linked. So for me, I think it's investing in data over the years will going to give us a good basis for engagement and conversation.
Thank you. Thank you so much to all of you. We're really out of time. So just to say, as I said, we're going to this recording will be posted up in the next few days after Easter. So if you celebrate, have a good Easter break. And thank you also to the audience, and have a good evening. So
thanks to everyone.
thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.